How are you?
Good, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
It's live. Yeah. So this is the question.
Just what it is. And then we have another one when
The full question.
revise them.
Okay. Turn the aircon off a little bit. You don't want to freeze while I present. It's cold enough outside.
Should be.
Does it sound okay still?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, get started.
Yeah, so, right. You'll be the chair today.
Yes.
So, normally for a mate's thesis defense or proposal defense, we invite Hermes to present for about 20 minutes. And then we have Eric, the external.
Hello. How are you?
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm just going to start with a quick introduction for whoever is on the live stream or who may be watching the live stream afterwards. So this is for my thesis proposal defense titled Analyzing Impacts of Networks Within the Maker Movement, the case for DIYBio in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. For the purposes of this stream today, the primary audience is going to be my committee, but anyone who is on the live stream may pose questions either in the Google Hangouts on air or on the pirate pad that is set up. So feel free to put your name down and jot down any comments that you would like on the pirate pad. Okay, and to start, my name is Hermes Huang. I'm from California, but I've been here in the MATES program since August. We just completed all of our coursework, and hopefully I will be going off to Indonesia, if all goes well today, next week. I'm being advised by Dr. Carl Middleton, who is here with us today, and Dr. Denise Sakara on Skype from the National University of Singapore. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. And just to start, I will be skipping most of the background material, assuming that the committee has already read the proposal. So if anybody on the live stream has any comments regarding that, we can chat later. Okay, so to start, the research question. How do makers perceive the development of their networks and communities in the process of engaging with open source hardware projects through DIYBio and the maker movement? And the sub-questions will focus on the behaviors, the perceptions, and the experiences of knowledge sharing throughout their experiences. And specifically, the objectives of this research will be to detail the creation of maker networks and communities surrounding the creation, the tinkering, the act of making open source hardware in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. It'll be also to critique conventional international development regarding research and development as it relates to science and technology. So I'll explain later, this is a sort of a very nuanced critique in terms of what level it targets and who specifically it targets. And then two more objectives would be to define, through the words of various actors connected to the House of Natural Fiber Foundation, the network developments of their impacts of their projects between 1999, which is when they began, to now. The House of Natural Fiber Foundation is an organization in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. They were Yogyakarta's first new media organization, and subsequently began to experiment with aspects of the maker movement, aspects of the DIYBio movement, the do-it-yourself movement, and as you might have read already, it's a very sort of fluid movement in terms of how people identify, how they join, and what motivates them to continue their work in this network. And finally, is to determine the views of the aforementioned actors regarding their relationships to the overall network globally, as they access the internet, as people come and interact with them in Indonesia from other parts of the world. In terms of the research site, it'll be in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, as I mentioned. I'll explain a little bit more in a minute about how this place is pretty special. So we'll just do that now. So Yogyakarta, why did I choose Yogyakarta? It's a pretty amazing place in terms of its history within the scope of Indonesia itself, and also globally within the maker movement at this point in time. It has over 300 centers of learning and art institutions, and it has a really unique history of art patronage because it is Indonesia's only autonomous area ruled by a sultanate who has a long history of art patronage in the region. And so because of that, you get all these really interesting people from all around Indonesia coming to learn, coming to explore, coming to create in this specific part of Indonesia. And also what makes it really interesting is that the House of Natural Fiber Foundation was founded by Indonesians who were educated in Indonesia, whereas in a lot of other cases of hacker spaces and maker spaces in Asia and the global south, they were oftentimes started by individuals that were educated abroad, lived abroad, brought back ideas to their hometowns and their countries, and started hackerspace as a result. But in Indonesia, this was not the case. So therefore, that leads into sort of how I will be selecting my sample. I will be beginning with the 3 original founders of the House of Natural Fiber Foundation for the network analysis. So I will begin with them to populate the numbers of people, the other people who are connected to the network. Who did they start? Who did they start with? How did they meet each other? Who else did they meet? And how did they go from there? And the timeline will be from April to May 2015. But I should mention that this is also nestled within a larger 2-year project as a part of the Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network, which is being funded by the Canadian government and the British government. So going into the conceptual framework, I have 3 major concepts that I will be using to sort of frame my research over the next 2 months and through the last month of writing and analysis. And that is knowledge democratization and cognitive justice, network social movements, and social network theory. The way that these sort of come together is that network social movements and social network theory really complement each other in terms of how social network theory binds together like the way that I will be looking at interactions between people, how people connect, whereas social movements will be looking at the larger picture of how organizations and people come together, how they, what motivates them, what sort of keeps them together, and what breaks them apart. And then this is all under the frame of knowledge democratization and cognitive justice in the way that these actors, what are these actors doing? How are they interacting with the network? What are they doing within the network that sort of spreads the idea of knowledge democratization? And in this case, we're talking about DIYBio, and more specifically, open source hardware. How do people access the maker movement to obtain the protocols, the schematics, the designs, the experiences of other people, download those into the local context, iterate upon them, redo it, iterate, test, and experience what it means to tinker with the protocols available online, and then re-upload their experiences and all of those actions back into the overall maker movement. And then a secondary step later on would be to look at how then those actions are again downloaded into other local communities. And in terms of cognitive justice is a concept that was coined as part of a lot of different movements as sort of a major idea that recognizes the knowledge created in different contexts. It recognizes the plurality of knowledge. It recognizes that indigenous knowledge is not some sort of marginalized knowledge separate from Western or global North type science, but it recognizes it as an equal level. It recognizes the value and the efforts and the presence of multiple actors and multiple ways of thinking. So those three together comprise a conceptual framework. So having explored through these concepts and the literature, I've come up with two really sort of broad gaps in knowledge. I've decided to keep it broad because largely in part because there really is not that much literature or empirical data on the maker movement as a whole. Whether you're talking global North, global South, there's been a lot of documentation. There's been, of course, that's sort of the thing. There's been a lot of documentation. All this stuff is online. It's all over the place. It's on Facebook. It's on wikis. It's on Twitter. But there's really been no sort of documentation in the body of literature of academia that then takes that documentation a step further to see the impacts, to see how people get together, what these people are doing, if there are impacts at all. And so specifically for my research, I will be looking at Asia, of course, which also is composed under the global South, and specifically Indonesia. Secondly, it's also to look at the organization of grassroots science efforts. And this comes back into the critique objective of the research. It's to take a look at how these people come together under the network to sort of see the impacts that people are making in terms of building their networks, and then further down the line to look at what these people are doing to what they are doing if they actually have an impact down the line. And the critique comes in when we're looking at the level, who is being supported, essentially. The way that I am taking this is that existing institutions of knowledge creation, of research and development, multinational corporations, the way that they're funding, the way that technology is being uptaken in the global South, ignores actual true participation of local communities on the ground. This was taken sort of using Arnstein's ladder of participation, which has 7 different levels, where the first 2 are of non-participation, so it's essentially informing local people about what's happening. Next 4 levels are categorized as tokenism, where people's opinions are taken in and people are consulted with, but at the end of the day, the final call and the final decisions are made by an outside institution. And whereas the final 3 steps of the ladder at the top are actual citizen participation in any sort of processes, and those 3 steps are composed of power delegation, partnership, and my part. And I would also, this is not totally fleshed out yet, but I would also really love to explore the idea of para-ethnography, where the participants of the network are also reflecting suggestions, feel free to put them down on the pirate pad. And probably the most difficult one that I haven't found a strong free and open source solution for is the QDA, the qualitative data analysis. There's ones I've been looking at in Vivo, QDA Minor Lite, which is QDA Minor Lite may be the most adequate one that I've found right now, but it's simply a free version of a fully closed software. So in terms of finding those, I'm still sussing that out just a little bit. Okay. I guess that is it in terms of what I'd like to present to you. Just a couple of thank yous. I'm being supported in the MAIDS program by the Rotary Global Grant Foundation. This project is being nestled under the Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network, and we're here at Chulalongkorn University. So thank you very much, and I will be putting as much as I can online in real time for comments over the next 2 months. So I'm looking forward to see you all there. Okay.
Thank you, Hermes.
Thank you.
So,
Any comments from the floor before I have some. Okay, please.
So the subject is a very interesting one. I've been watching these kinds of activities, these kinds of online networks, and also at SEI, the idea of action research, participatory research is certainly part of what we consider. I have a few concerns and critiques. First, just in the structure of the paper, it took quite a while before you got to the point of pointing out that some of the people in what you're calling the maker movement might question whether it's a movement, because they might not feel that they're challenging something.
Yes.
I'd also never heard the term before, and I know people in this movement, I think, but a definition of it would have been nice early on, like what actually is it? On the background, you seem to equate science with knowledge-based decision-making, which is not the same thing. Science is an institution, and it seems like what you're proposing is the acceptance of alternative forms of knowledge other than through formal science in decision-making, which is fine. If you're saying that, and it sometimes sounded like you were saying the value of peer-reviewed research, or research that could pass peer review because of its methods, should be devalued, which I didn't quite understand, and that especially when you put in that all inputs are equal. I was thinking, you know, I've been on many participatory engagements, and frankly, scientists or not, there's a different quality to the inputs, and you can tell. Is there no process at all for deciding which is a more coherent, cogent, informative input in this than others? And if there is any such process, is there not a hierarchy? I mean, from my own personal experience, I do research that would go into say, a background paper, working paper. It is not as careful well, I try to do a very good job, but it's not as rigorous as what I would put in a peer-reviewed paper. I still think it's valuable. I still think it's informative, and I think what the farmers I've met doing experiments on their fields are doing is valuable and informative, and possibly sitting below the radar of science. But still, I would say that there's anyway some hierarchy there. That's on evaluating knowledge creation, which is completely different than valuing knowledge inputs into decision-making processes. And there, I think there is a real problem with overvaluing science as opposed to other forms of knowledge in decision-making processes, especially the knowledge of the people who are most affected by the decisions. But it's a different thing. In terms of methodology, I'm wondering if you're going to do a social network analysis and this is an online network, is that correct?
In many ways, it's an online network. I mean, there's two aspects to what could be considered the maker movement. It is the experiences and everything that's uploaded online, and the communications that people do online. But it's also the physical spaces of learning, the physical spaces of interaction, what could be considered a hacker space or a hacker community.
Okay, then a couple of questions on methods. A lot of the online social networks are analyzed using those network data. I didn't hear you mention that. They're often fairly large, dense networks with the distributions of participation in terms of time and activity often have very long tails, which means if you do a snowball and you really try to get everybody, you're gonna get a huge group. But you can do it if you use the network activity data, and you could compare the network structure of this network to that of other online networks and see if there's a difference, because that was a hypothesis you put into your background. You actually said it's going to be different, and that's something you can test with those online network activity data. The other one is if it's a network and you have some idea of a membership, why use a snowball technique if you know who's there?
I don't know.
They don't know who's there. So it's a network.
It's also, the analysis will also be done over time. So it depends on the year that the original founders met people, in terms of, and it's the year that people met people, the year that the original founders met people, how those people dropped in and out of the network over the course of 15 years, around the projects that they were doing, the engagements with open source hardware, who interacted. Because oftentimes, some people may, in one specific project, some people may have been with the organization for a long time and they're engaging with it. They may have brought in some people from the outside who only want to interact with this singular project.
Okay, so no information that they could, that House of Fibers could provide to you would give you that. You've got to go through this snowball. Okay, then my very last comment is before you go to the field, you should have your survey. I would have expected to see it already at this point. Okay, that's it. So, survey instrumenting.
Do you want to respond to any of those questions or points?
Yeah. In terms of the way that I'm seeing science in terms of this research is that it's a method. I'm looking at science in terms of a method and how that method has been used by institutions, whether it's House of Natural Fiber or an international NGO or a government. And the way that the method has been utilized to then to not be as inclusive, to people, and this is specifically around hardware. It's a critique of hardware itself, scientific hardware, in terms of access to the hardware, such as microscopes. I've listed a lot of laboratory equipment in my proposal, and it's the network analysis is to come and see how people have come together to create this, and then that gives them access. Yes, there are always going to be questions of quality. There's always going to be questions of peer review. I don't discount anything that has already been done, but part of this research is to see if things could be done a different way, with the view that science is something that is not necessarily an institution, but it's just a method that people have used for different means.
Okay. Double check your source fire oven against method. Okay.
I've had many opportunities to ask questions. I think Ajahn Punaj.
I agree with you on many issues. Let me put some comment in this specific direction. When I browsed to your paper, I found that to some extent it's quite difficult to digest. Right? Why? Because your statement of research problem and your literature review is not reflect your questions and your hypothesis. Why? Because when you're talking about these so-called emerging post-industrial revolutions, I found that there are quite a few number of keywords that make me very confused. Let me put it this way. First, when you're talking about space, you mentioned that ICT is a transcendent mechanism to allow people all around the world to work together or even think in a similar way, right? Then you need to take a look on space theory. The theory that's talking about space, how ongoing literature that working on space perceive specific physical space or cognitive space or information space. They are not the same. So you need to understand how space being studied before you're talking about network, before you're talking about activities that has been happening in the network. That's why it's very challenging. Second one, I found that your specific questions on existing R&D model, to some extent, it's a bit under review. Because when you're talking about R&D model, what does it mean? Is it a conventional R&D model that has been developed for quite some years? There are around 5 or 6 generations of R&D, so-called conventional R&D. What does it mean R&D in these specific questions? What does it mean science when you're talking about it? Is it the product of specific R&D, or is it just the new knowledge that they happen to be collected from their own activity and experience? So you need at least to take a look on the literatures on R&D model in particular. The third one, when you talk about technology transfers and globalization in your literature review, I think it needs more effort to review literature on this specific area, because you only rely on one literature, right? You rely on my friend's paper, Pettobelli, and it's very old. It's already 2003. Yeah. So
in the online world, that's old.
And apart from that, it's a lot of international development literature. So you need to balance between so-called literatures on science, technology studies, technology and social change, R&D model, and technology development. I would say that technology transfer is already almost an outdated concept. It's not only for development, but also in the business arena as well. So you may need to take a look on the concept like techno-globalism, technology regime, That may shed some light because your specific case study it's far from so-called conventional establishment of institutional setup. So I would say that you have some room to maneuver from these three specific dimensions. What else? Okay, sectoral matter. You need to clarify more about these specific case studies. Why? Because in each specific sector, they have different set of so-called R&D activities, innovation model. So in that sense, you need to take a look on so-called other similar development in maybe in different countries or in different setup, so that you can understand its specific platform. So I think what else? Okay, that's all. I think.
Can I quickly add one comment to what you said? On technological regime, there's a concept of niche technology development that actually might fit very well with this. So if you use that as an organizing concept, it could be a better entry point.
Niche technology development.
Socio-technological regime or technological regime, if you look for that, you'll find niches as a key component, and this would fit very well.
Adrian Smith wrote quite a lot on that.
That's more Adrian Smith.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
More Adrian Smith.
Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting idea from Eric, actually. It depends how you want to link your...
It's true. I will admit the literature review needs to be fleshed out quite a bit more. It's something I will be working on.
The air conditioning.
Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
I live in a room with no aircon, so I'm used to this.
Denisa, how are you on the audio?
I don't hear you very well, but I really did hear everything that was the comments, which were great. Should I say something now, or what is the model you're using?
Yeah. Do you want to respond to Ajahn Punad?
So I should add my comment, even if an advisor, because I wasn't certain whether I'm allowed to speak as an advisor. So first of all, I'll put my comments also in the document because I think it will help you, work. It's a bit too broad. Like my biggest worry is you're trying to tackle too many terms, too many concepts. It's a bit broad, and as being part of the 2 years research project, like my main interest in this study, and I somehow that is the part which I will emphasize, is that issue of what is open science. Because I agree with the previous gentleman that you are using the concept of science rather freely, and the concept of R&D. And the big question is, do you want to go in that direction? Is this an alternative R&D model or not? Or is it does it serve more the socio-technical systems? Does it create like some new forms of socio-technical system? If you decide to go that way, I would actually strongly advise to use the concept of grassroots innovation, because in Indonesia, I don't see really, or at least in Yogyakarta, I don't see much evidence that there is some developed R&D infrastructure, or, I don't know, maybe we are all wrong, and this needs to be completely based on that research on technology transfer in Indonesia and R&D in Indonesia. But I'm a bit worried that will lead us further from the main goal of that 2 years project, which is to define what is open science, how these grassroots activities form science, are they scientific at all, do they enable science, and what are some evaluation criteria, how to assess such activities. So I really liked the comments before, and some of it really resonates with some things I was putting in the text. My main concern is exactly whether this is a movement at all. And that relates to the methodology, because if it's not such a strong movement, then the social network analysis needs some change. I do see that these movements are organized rather around the workshops, around these temporary events where, actors come and go and set up their new initiatives, and they set up their own workshops, and then they make their own tools. So I think the social network analysis needs to push more this like the workshops and the events, the processes rather than the actors and their closeness or distance or so on. And it will be interesting to see how the method can be pushed to like work with that, because that would be the criticism, whether it is a movement or what is this semi, like it's organized, but it's temporary organized activities, and what are their impacts, because we see that there are some, but they are not described. And then I really like the comment about science. In what sense it is a science? Because that goes to, okay, if it's an alternative movement, it has an alternative concept of science, it describes its activities as scientific. So how is rigor performed? Or what are the values that we can still call scientific, but how they are done in case of these activities? So I think this could be somehow incorporated in that. So I wouldn't, so for me, the social movement theory doesn't completely relate to at least what I see on the ground happening there. So I'm not completely certain that that term is even useful for this analysis. Maybe it's more about pushing the boundary of social network analysis to be more perceptive of the influence of events and processes in forming the network, rather than saying the network forms the events and these temporary things. So yes, open science, how we define science, because that wasn't discussed at all. Question whether you really want to move into that R&D discussions at all, and how to describe. So like actually my main motivation to work with Hermes, maybe that's interesting for the rest of the committee, and interest in this project is actually the lack of empirical data. So I see like the biggest value in your study, that it will be the first study that provides some empirical data, and that is why seriously the survey, the data you will collect, that's essential. And I'm also missing that a bit in the proposal. I see at the end of the document you were trying to do it, and I will still try to help as much as I can, but it needs to be, for me, the most interesting part of this study is if you really push it more into this empirical research of data. But without the right questions, of course, it's highly problematic. I hope that you do hear me, and we can continue.
And Hermes, she didn't hear you. Maybe you could step around here to respond. Yeah. Okay.
Do you want to
Yeah, I
respond
hear
to
you
both
better
Conrad
now,
and
yeah.
Denisa?
Yeah, I was thinking about responding to both Art and Denisa.
Can you hear him now?
Yes,
Okay,
I
good,
hear you
good.
perfectly when you're in front of me.
All right, good.
Questions about space,
And
science. What does it mean, science R&D model?
technical regime.
Questioning movement.
Right, so these are all things that I did struggle with actually in writing the proposal, and you definitely caught upon sort of how wide ranging the proposal is, even in terms of how I define movement, in terms of how I sort of struggle to encompass and describe what's going on in a very short amount of space. It's true in terms of like space. I don't really necessarily know the motivations, like what's going on, if this is a movement. The in terms of using social network social movements as a concept, that was also, I recognize that it was a bit of something that I had to bend a little bit to fit the situation, because it doesn't necessarily. From the very beginning, as soon as I started reading, I was like, there's nothing specific that the entire movement is fighting against, which is a strong definition of social movements that we've seen in the past. But I decided to try and explore that a little bit further and see how I could mesh that with the social network theory, which, like Denisa says, and I also talked to Carl about this, is that social network theory, for the case of this research, focuses too much on specifically the relations between human actors. So we were also discussing things like actor network theory to take a look at, which also encompasses non-human actors in the idea of organizations and networks. But I felt like by using actor network theory for everything would compromise the actual on-the-ground work. I thought it would, by going in with a single lens that encompasses everything that I do, would not necessarily represent the people on the ground as accurately as if I could try and push the boundaries of social network theory alone. And in terms of science, I see what you guys are saying, and this is something that I need to integrate more into the proposal and definitely take a closer look and tighten up the argument quite a bit in terms of both science, globalization, and technology development. Is there anything that I missed from you, Denisa?
It's okay.
Is it possible to follow up?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so a follow-up to that, I can see why you don't want to miss out on important characteristics of the people on the ground. But in fact, you're coming in with a heavy-duty theoretical framework that might or might not sit with how they picture themselves. You alluded to using an anthropological approach, which seems nice to me. And this idea from Denise, if I'm understanding it correctly, the idea is to push the boundaries of SNA, because in this case, it's not that you've got the network that then has activities and so on. It's that these activities and events, which are normally, you don't think of isolated events and activities as being associated with network theory. But in this case, those events generate the network and elements of it persist, which is interesting. I don't know of any analytical tools in social network analysis that would allow you to look at that effectively. It's but it would be very interesting to look at it, and you could probably take, you don't have to completely reinvent things. You can take static network metrics and apply them over time, and then you would get some of those dynamics, and that could help you, and then you could tie that to an event. So you're still using completely accepted, documented techniques, but in a new way. So it seems like you could do that. My only other comment is, for some of the things you want to do, for example, challenging development models, there's a lot of reason to challenge development models. I would say leave that for your career, but maybe not in your thesis.
Your comment about including the events and the artifacts and the non-human actors, that was actually originally, that's going back to October when me and Denisa were first talking about this. It was really centered around the creation of hardware itself, and in the process of exploring the theory and sort of struggling with it is what came out into this proposal, which really sort of dropped the central idea of the hardware for this specific analysis. But from what I'm hearing is that there's a possibility, and I should bring them back in, and that'll actually come back to the original ideas that we really wanted to look at, was how people organize around the creation of open source hardware and what that does in terms of impacts and on the network, on the ground.
And I'm sorry, that reminds me.
I don't know whether I can add something to this discussion. I mean, it's a general characteristics of all these maker movements. I'm looking around the world. They actually they identify and they speak of themselves in terms of the tools they're building, objects they're building, and formats.
Yes.
So the typical, like we just recently had the free open source software meeting here in Singapore, and when you read their report, it's all about, that many events happened, this many workshops happened, this many things we built, this many things we did. So the whole, they're not against something as a movement. It's not even pro something necessarily, but it's all about this identification with the tools and with the event, which I think it would be interesting to, I see it like in Indonesia, it's similar in a way. They even don't care whether they're called makers and hackers, but this, importance of the process of how they build tools and how, they do one workshops on microscope and then other people create like a new workshop and a new organization around it elsewhere and continue the work. There is some strange type of technology transfer which can be described there in that sense. So I definitely like the social network analysis. It's definitely good to do the social network analysis in the traditional sense, map the individuals and the institutions, because there are also these interesting heterogeneous relations between universities, village communities. But ask the questions, at what point do they reach out to these other institutions, or which events maybe trigger these like strange hybrid relations? So to still keep, to have it very empirical, but maybe apply the social network analysis also to the artifacts and the workshops, rather, and the processes, rather than just to the individuals, even if it is a stretch of the original meaning. But after all, social network analysis is just a type of network analysis, which is about following the power laws and following some structure behind the data. It's about that.
Let me elaborate on these specific questions. When you say that this is part of open and for collaborative science, right? If you want to use the social network analysis, you may think about the quality and dimensions of science when we touch upon this social network, like how they access scientific knowledge,
Yes.
how they make themselves understand the specific knowledge, the source of knowledge, and also how they create new knowledge. So in that sense, you can take a look on the technological ladder concept. First, you have a capability to understand science. Is it from this specific social development or network? And if possible, when did they graduate from just so-called general social network and become a network of so-called active scientists? So in that sense, you may need to have some identification of specific dimension to analyze this qualitative analysis.
It just reminded me of something. I'm sorry. My brother is arguably part of the maker movement. He's on online communities. He makes things. He shares them with other people. He shares his designs and sends them around. I once asked him about it. I said, what are the origins of this? And he said, actually, it was the 17th century watchmaker's tools, because it was the first time you could make things on a desktop. So I don't know. I haven't seen that in the history of technology books, but that's something to think about too, is it might have a deeper history.
I think, this isn't anything new per se. I mean, the things that are new about it are the way that people communicate through the internet.
Actually, yeah, sorry, I'm actually interested exactly in that historical, but part of my research is going into these historical origins of tinkering.
Oh, neat.
Because it goes against the 16th century concept of Baconian science, which is about the system.
Okay.
And Francis Bacon, when he criticizes, actually when he talks about what is science, he criticizes the mechanical artists. And these people they tinker without a system that start with like making and building before they develop the system. So it does go into some interesting origins of our concept of science and the relation between institution, system, and science. So I'm really excited about this comment.
Okay,
I didn't think
great.
about the watchmakers.
All right.
It is interesting because it's also been our other collaborator, who is also one of the founders of the House of Natural Fiber Foundation. In a few weeks, we're going to what she described as the origins of citizen science in Indonesia. And so to sort of look at what that actually means in the eyes of someone on the ground is also going to be really interesting. Yeah, this is really great. There's a lot of comments that sort of bring me back to a lot of the ideas that I had in the beginning, but have been struggling to integrate and mend and bend to fit in this proposal.
Is there anyone online that we need to ask? If there's
Mikey,
any
is
comments?
there any other, happen to be any
No
comments?
questions. Everyone viewer.
Okay, great.
Only one viewer.
There's probably some had few problems with the internet and probably it's
Nothing on the pirate tab. Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Any other final comments for Hermes?
I think you need to synchronize your hypothesis with the theory.
Okay.
At least you need to decide if you want to dig deeper on so-called concept of R&D, or just a concept of space or science by itself. What is science? And one option is to concentrate on demarcation line between demand and supply side of science, because your proposal is mainly involved with people from demand side. So this is a specific contribution that you may need to understand so-called model of supply side or supply driven in science technology innovation and demand driven science technology innovation, which at this moment demand driven tend to be self-sustained. That's why you have this kind of phenomena. You have maker, you have hacker, because demand side now they are encountered with their own so-called science technological process.
Yeah, I've heard that concept called "scratch your own itch." If you know you want something, you do it yourself.
I mean, I think for the maze program, this is quite a challenging thesis because it goes almost goes beyond international development studies in many ways, or at least Hermes is pushing the boundary, I think, on how we understand international development studies, which is a good thing. Like, this is not a bad thing. So it's.
Oh, that's right. It's required to be in the thesis.
Well, actually, I mean, if we look at things from the perspective of like development studies, then the thing that's kind of absent here is like the actual impact on the communities. I mean, this is an early discussion that we're having with Hermes. Like, what's the relationship between a maker movement, if it indeed exists, and those that actually use the outcome of that maker movement? So I know we're moving away from that, but I think that the thing to bear in mind would be how to relate this to international development studies in the end as well.
I don't know that we're moving that much away from it. You drop movement, and you say it's a phenomenon. It's a set of activities, and it is. It has got active participants in Indonesia, and it seems like it's thriving. It's been around for what, a decade and a half?
Yes.
Okay, so there's if it's really just sitting there and nothing is happening with this and it's not being taken up, I couldn't see it lasting 15 years. So there's got to be something there about what's being generated actually being taken up and used. I would imagine. In which case, the same concept could be there of this phenomenon generating things for people.
No, this is the thing, that it's the for people thing. Because originally there was another side of the questioning, which was like, how do these organizations actually relate to a wider community and the types of technologies that are being produced? But now this has been, I mean, this was beyond the scope in the end of the research because it was becoming far too big already. I think maybe as an advisor, my concern is actually still the size of the project with such a large number of interviews. But I mean, if it is possible to work with research assistants to help with the analysis as well as with the data collection, then it might make it more manageable, I think.
Yes. Denise, I was wondering if you had any ideas about how to do that, how to capture outside the people doing the activities and the people taking it up. Any experience or thoughts?
I mean, the in and out grouping in case of this movement, it's not like so clear.
No.
Because if there is not a strong sense of identity, or even if it's performed, I'm not certain how serious it is. I mean, there are even people that say we are not makers and hackers. We're this Indonesian thing, or there are all kinds of discourses and ways of identification. And that is why it's like really difficult to decide which of these, theories are actually which is the best way to frame it in a way. It's still a new field. Like, there are a couple of authors or a couple of us that are starting to write about the hacker and maker movement, and some of us position it in the STS field. Many people position it more into this design thinking and design as a way of conceptualizing the world, basically. But I would like really push this. He got some really interesting questions where he can position it and how to create the hypotheses. And I was thinking actually both the R&D side, if we think of it as some alternative R&D model for the developing world or for Yogyakarta, or if we push more the agenda, is it science? What type of collaborative open science it is? What are the criteria of this type of science? Both of them are completely legitimate in case of this specific organization, because HONF over the year developed from this early, like, citizen science, open science approach. And I would say in the last 2 years, since they got something called Fab Lab, like digital fabrication tools, they're pushing much more the R&D agenda. They want to be this place where people come to build small businesses, to do innovation and so on. So I think it will depend on you, Hermes, for this study, for this period, the first period, on which of these aspects you want to concentrate, because I agree the literature review and the hypothesis should somehow connect more with is it what type of R&D it is, or what type of science it was or it is. So I do think actually you'll have to decide. But the main problem is they don't have a strong identity. It is more about the events, it's more about the objects, it's more about the tools of building, and it is about, and at the same time, many people join, leave, they start their own thing. It's very dynamic as a phenomenon. And what is important is to see how empirically we can study it, because most of us for now this empirical study was never done. Most of us that write about these movements, we usually do ethnography. We are like participant observation, do participant observation or some action form of research, but it's not very empirical in terms of data. No.
Right.
Okay. Any other?
The baseline that I'm hearing is it's here and it needs to come here.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that?
It's very interesting for me to hear this because I come from a business background. I'm not an academic, but to try to hear how you're categorizing things and try to fit things into boxes, especially for a movement like this, which is struggling desperately to come out of the box. I would seriously contest whether, from a science development point of view, whether this would really be a demand-driven opportunity or phenomenon versus a more kind of a supply side pushing forward. I think in my idea, a tinkerer, a hacker really is doing it for themselves. It's not necessarily a wider scientific research community that's answering a social need, environmental need, and things like that. Yeah, this is a very difficult one to play with. I think Hermes' research project has a huge scope to work in, but I think it's also that's the nature of the movement that's happening at the moment. And to try and narrow it down is extremely difficult. Also, this would, from what I've seen and everything I've read, be one of the first real serious hard looks at what's happening outside of. I mean, there's stuff being looked at within the DIYBio movement, but within the wider hacker movement, it's still very new. There's so much open ground to play with. So I would also be a little bit easy on him too. Yeah, I would say definitely successive students that come through that are trying to narrow down probably particular points that he's hammered out. You could be a lot harder on because you already have a background to work from. This is new turf to work on. Definitely bear that in mind.
Just a quick reaction to that. I mean, the technique that I'm aware of when the boxes are not appropriate, the ones that have been developed in the past, is anthropological interview techniques in which you determine the categories from the people you're interviewing. You don't start with them. It's very time consuming. So I'm a little worried about it for this, but it might. It's a PhD, not a master's. But is there any? Could you do before you do your interviews? Could you do some of that textual analysis to see if you could do a kind of a quick runaround? Instead of doing the classic anthropological interview, you would go and you would find what categories people use to describe themselves before you do your interviews, and let them build the boxes. Take the boxes from what they say.
Yeah, this is actually, we can do this really quickly. There's a lot of data mining tools.
It's never quick.
Yeah.
Okay, but yeah.
Well, not quick, but it'll be quick.
Yeah, Hermes, that's an excellent idea to take some of the descriptions from the website, or maybe even to try to do an interview before you go there, and to try this, like basically to code it in a way. It's simple, like it could be like a simple question you can ask yourself while you're reading or listening. What is the function of science they see in that particular activity? Is it outreach? Is it really that they're contributing some new knowledge? Is it something else? What are the function of the scientific research or the activity? What is the value they see? Why they're doing it basically in that workshop? Why they're building the microscope, or why they're taking samples from, I don't know, their environment, or why they're building something. Even in terms of R&D, it will show, like, is it because they built capacity to do something, or because they want to start a new business, or is it just for fun? Is it just for exploring something? So I think there is a couple of functions and categories you can identify in the descriptions, which would help you define what type of science it is, what type of institution it is, and similar.
I would add as well, I think something that might help you a little bit as well is this whole concept of sensory journalism is starting to kind of hit home very hard at the moment. I've just seen it all starting coming out in the last few weeks. It's basically where journalists themselves are adopting techniques that have been developed within the hackerspace movements. So whether that's particularly sensory things, so they're analyzing water, or they're analyzing air quality, or whatever it may be, and using, so people from non-traditional science backgrounds are then using these techniques in their journalistic pieces. And there's a lot of pieces that have been written by these journalists at the moment to explain their experiences, both from very often it's a negative standpoint going in, and suddenly realizing the power of these tools all of a sudden, that the hackerspace movement themselves don't necessarily realize while they're busy developing it. For me, that's really the kind of the quintessential tinkerer, not necessarily realizing per se what it is they've created. And only once other people adopt it do they really see where it can go towards. And so they might be at the cutting edge and they lose out on the benefits that come out. That's always that next, the second wave that comes through that guys benefit from it. So I don't know if that will help at all in defining certain blocks in space.
Sort of identifying those techniques in the way that people are already doing things.
The way that people are using what's coming out.
This is like a conscious adoption of the techniques. No, it's your.
Most of the journalists themselves that are consciously adopting these things. Because, for example, they want to go and study a river. So you have rivers running through Yogyakarta, and they're doing their water E. coli analysis and whatnot. So the hackerspace, for example, would be involved in kind of messing around, and they design their own microfluidics analysis. The journalists. But for me, what's more interesting is this kind of first step beyond the hackerspace. This first catalyst really that gets things going within the wider community. That's really when you hit the public, I believe. As long as these guys can communicate what's been happening in numbers and in hard numbers, then the public might take notice and suddenly be interested in perhaps what a hackerspace could yield. Whether this applies to your work right now or not, I'm not sure. But it sounds like it's so broad that we need to find an angle.
And Carl, that sounds like that's what you were interested in, is how the technology development spills over into use.
Right, how it
And
gets
then
taken
that's-
up and applied and has, I mean, sort of tangible impact in the even wider community beyond like the hackerspaces themselves. But that's well beyond, I think, what's feasible now. But I mean, it's a very interesting example. Is this in Thailand?
Just got your PhD right there.
Yeah, that's right, PhD topic.
She said there's a 2-year project coming up somewhere.
Also, just to introduce Brian, Brian is a farmer and a businessman. He owns Right Home Organics Farms, and I've been working with them for the last couple of months, for credit for the MAIDS program. But we've been working to develop Thailand's first peer-to-peer digital organic certification system.
Excellent.
But he's also like super into DIYBio, and we've been talking with a lot of hackers and makers that have been springing up in the last couple of months in Bangkok. Yeah.
Any final comments? If not, we should wrap up, I guess.
Yeah, I think we need to talk about the title of Thesis.
Yeah.
Actually, it can be discussed now, but also formally, if it needs to be changed, it can be saved for the thesis defense itself.
Okay.
So I think we need to have a meeting.
We do, and we've never done this before in this way. So the committee members need to have a meeting. So we probably need to turn off the online things.
Okay.
Apart from Denisa.
So yeah, we'll just thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you for agreeing or not agreeing to the live broadcast, which I'm hoping to do again for July. I'll be pushing it more, at least so maybe my dad will tune in or something. But yeah, thank you for all your comments. They're really everything that was said was really, really valuable, and I appreciate it a lot. And we worked a lot to really bring it down in the next weeks and tighten up the argument and the direction that this would be going. But I think there is a direction that just needs to be more focused.
Yeah, you've got a good topic. You've got a very nice topic.
Okay, so
can you stop the broadcast,
Yep.
Mikey?
yeah, and then us four will have to have a quick discussion.
All right, very good.
Mike, can you end the broadcast? Thank you.
Okay.